Forests have been a part of human culture for our whole history.
Over the course of Colorado's history, humans have changed the forest in all sorts of ways.
We're seeing larger fires. We're seeing more bark beetle.
The unforeseen outcome and unintended consequences.
To understand what's happening today, having historical context is really important.
History can really open our eyes to the intricacy of these ecosystems. The changes are really daunting.
But forests are changing and adapting and experiencing disturbances all the time.
It's really important to emphasize how dynamic our forests are, how dynamic they always have been, and how dynamic they always will be.
This program was made possible by the History Colorado State Historical Fund,
supporting projects throughout the state to preserve, protect, and interpret Colorado's architectural and archaeological treasures. History Colorado State Historical Fund. Create the future, honor the past.
with additional funding provided in memory of Deanna E. LaCamera, the Benedict Family Foundation, and members like you. With special thanks to the Denver Public Library, History Colorado, the Colorado Office of Film, Television, and Media, and to these organizations.
Human relationships with forests go back to the dawn of time.
We evolved in forests. Our ancestors came down out of the trees. We are children of the forest, literally.
Throughout human history, people have made all sorts of meanings of forests and of trees.
People have revered trees in many cultures. The tree of life symbol is pretty much ubiquitous in every culture that represents the interconnectedness of all things.
Robin Hood with Sherwood Forest, his band's place of refuge. At the same time, Grimm's fairy tales. The forests were dark, scary places where bad things happened. Both good and bad cultural connotations.
Political meanings, from the Great Charter Oak in Connecticut, which played an important role in colonial and early national history, up through the Great Council Tree out on Chief Urey's place near Montrose.
We've depended on trees for food, fuel, clothing, shelter for pretty much our entire existence.
Watershed values in particular.
Forests capture water. The rivers are basically born in the forests.
They provide stability to the soil so the soil doesn't erode into our rivers.
Greater amount of carbon is stored by forests than the atmosphere. That's a pretty staggering number.
So when we think of forests, we think of the trees, but it's the entire ecosystem that's there.
About 80% of the species that live on land use forests for habitat in some way. So in addition to all the benefits provided by forests to us, we also have the benefits to biodiversity, which is probably more important than all those other things. We're all surrounded by forests in Colorado. Roughly 56% of the Southern Rocky Mountains is forested. Colorado forests in particular, ecologically speaking, are really interesting because we're in the edge of many different species ranges.
That doesn't mean that there are sharp edges or sharp boundaries.
When we think about the United States, southwestern species tend to have northern boundaries. In the Colorado area, species from the northern Rockies meets its southern extent just around the southern border of Colorado, and they overlap in the Colorado area.
Trees, somewhat like people, have different tolerances. Some of us like the heat, some of us like the cold, and same with the trees. And that's what makes our forest so unique, is that we have such a huge elevation gradient.
The gradient of different forest types that we have in about 50 linear miles, but thousands of feet of elevation, is equivalent to if you drove from the plains of Texas all the way up to the Arctic Circle in Canada.
And you just see all these different types of forests, and it's all based on the elevation, the precipitation, the temperature. Forests can have different species composition depending on the aspect, which way it's facing towards the sun. So southern aspects get more sunlight, they're drier. Northern aspects are more cool and moist.
Literally, when you step across a ridge, you're stepping into a completely different ecosystem.
Colorado's unique blend of landscapes create the most complex forests of any in the West, lending to the diverse and iconic sites of the state.
Skiing through spruce fir and lodgepole, mountain biking in the Ponderosa pine.
Kanush Pass, Kebler Pass, San Juans.
Have you been to Maroon Bells? These are places that are recognized the world over nowadays. Pikes Peak, which inspired America the Beautiful. Not a lot of forested landscapes can make that claim, but it's something that Colorado's forests can definitely claim.
The beauty is unmatched.
What we're seeing in our forests now, particularly in the last 20 or 30 years, is a lot of change.
Initially, when I look at the forest, I see a lot of dead trees. There's a lot of beetle kill. There's a lot of areas that have burned.
In the last 20 years, we've had a lot of really large wildfires that have burned really intensely, and it's slow to regenerate. We have had this mountain pine beetle outbreak that coincided with the early 2000s drought that killed acres and acres of trees. How big a change is this really?
To understand whether what's happening now is unprecedented, we look into the past to understand how forests developed.
What were the processes that defined them and perpetuated them?
Colorado's forests grow slower than a lot of places. So in many ways we see the evidence of historical events even more strongly here. Those dynamics from things that happened 100 and 150 years ago are still playing themselves out in our slow-growing forests.
We have to find ways to reconstruct what was going on in forests.
How do you recreate a forest?
You have to talk to the trees.
One of the nice things about trees is they don't move. They live their entire lifetime in one location. That whole lifetime they're influenced by whatever happens to come along and affect the growth of that tree. We can find out what affected those trees for any particular year.
One way is to court a live tree with an increment borer. It doesn't hurt the tree.
Trees grow once per year, at least the trees that grow here in Colorado and other temperate areas of the world. They only grow in the summertime, they quit growth. Next year they do the same thing, so one ring per year. We can look at past climate from the tree rings. Climate is controlling the growth of the trees, so all of the trees in an area are going to show more or less the same pattern of growth. Because climate's controlling the growth of the trees, the ring patterns are going to match. If it's a dry year for that tree over there, it's a dry year for this tree over here. Both of them are going to show a small ring for that particular year. This way we can get a record of the tree rings without having to cut the tree.
And then you can look at the tree rings and determine how old it was when it germinated and started growing.
We start with living trees, we work our way backwards. Again, to be a good dendrochronologist, you just have to know how to count backwards from 10. We put a dot on every decade. So we work our way backwards, we put a dot on 2010, 2000, 1990, and so on.
If the tree is dead, take a sample of the stump or the log, and we would then cross-date that to determine when that tree was born and then when it died. And then we can reconstruct how big the trees were, what kind of tree species were there, and then we map those to determine what that spatial arrangement of those trees were as well. How many trees were on a piece of land, the size of those trees, what type of tree was it?
In addition to using tree rings to reconstruct forest history, we've also used historical photographs.
Historical photographs supply a unique historical data set to track long-term trends to see how forests have changed. Aerial photos give us the ability to really zoom into the landscape. Right here would be one single shot. Right? And to actually create this mosaic and be able to say anything about the whole area, we had to use lots and lots of individual photos and stitch it all together. You can actually pick out individual trees. There's a lot of detail in that landscape.
Using historical landscape photographs, we go out and match the scene, take a modern photograph, and show the changes that have occurred over 100 or more years. Often we would go into those scenes that were photographed, core trees, determine the history, so we can put together an overall interpretation of the changes that you see in the photographs.
These Colorado researchers have each worked years to decades to get a better understanding of the dynamics at play. And they have unearthed a wide variety of changes in our forests.
Using dendrochronology, we found that in our ponderosa pine forest, tree density has increased 2 to 3 times. So there's 2 to 3 times more trees out on the landscape than there were. Most of those trees are in small diameter, and we're seeing a shift in not only the number of trees, but also a shift in the species composition. We also found that fire has been excluded from these forests for over a century now.
Using air photos, we identified the areas that either gained or lost forest. A lot of the change that we've seen in the 20th century has been lower elevation forests and higher elevation forests. We saw a lot of forest gain. The middle elevation sites didn't actually change as much.
Using repeat photography, you can see some areas have really increased in stand density, some areas have recovered after fire, some areas have not recovered after fire.
A variety of pressures have shaped these changes that we see in our forests, some natural, but many due to human activities. To understand these changing forest dynamics, we first need to understand how human dynamics have changed across landscapes. In relatively recent history, the most significant transformations took root with the settlers.
When Europeans started populating and arriving in North America, you saw this real conflicted idea about forests and their use when they got over here. Imagine coming over from Europe in the 17th century and landing in a pretty much solid deciduous forest that's 2 or 3 times the size of the entire continent you came from. It was immense and overwhelming. It was a tremendous natural wealth that they landed into, but also it was kind of an obstacle at the same time to what they really wanted to do with the land. Trees were valuable, but they were valuable when you cleared them out of the way. It's not an overstatement to say the United States was built on wood. Up until the middle of the 19th century, 90% of our energy needs came from wood. Today, oil provides roughly 30% of US energy use. So it was extremely important for people, and a lot of settlement across the United States followed where those resources were.
As settlers came into Colorado, they brought a whole range of different ideas about forests.
What really brought the first mass of people was the gold rush that started in 1859.
Initially, the mountains didn't much concern gold miners. They were interested in the gold that was in the streams along the Front Range. Very, very quickly, though, they became frustrated with how meager the findings were in their pans. And so they looked to the mountains. They started heading up in search of the mother lode.
You can't overstate the rush of activity and the pace and scale of that activity. I've heard it described as things not changing on a daily basis, but an hourly basis. Basic land law at the time was first come, first served. So there were mad scrambles of people trying to make their fortune and stake their claims. Towns would pop up overnight and could be depopulated overnight.
When we're talking about mining, it is very natural to talk about the mineral. Mining involves timber in every dimension.
For the production of the mining itself, building a sluice or a flume to channel your water into, to sort for your precious metal. Think about where the miners lived. First it was tents, then it was log cabins, then it was kind of rough-hewn wood structures to milled wood structures. Think of an old mining frontier town with its main street and the facades. And wood is the energy source they're heating these buildings with and cooking their food with.
They set fire to forests to expose outcroppings. This is a key technique of prospectors. Miners tended to not be very careful with their campfires, and so they introduced all sorts of accidental fires. And here it's really important to realize what mining was about.
If you're going to go underground, if you're going to dig underground, then you have to support that underground space. If you don't support the walls and roof of a mine, that's just a death trap.
And so they had to use timbers to support the mines. The mines consumed massive quantities of lumber. Basically every successful mining camp was surrounded by a widening circle of forest decimation.
It's pretty striking if you look at historic photos of mining towns anywhere in Colorado. You'll see pretty bare hills around any of the mining settlements.
Many areas are not affected by the mining business, but that is a huge, enormous campaign of deforestation localized around mining areas because it's not an easy thing in that era to transport wood over long distances.
The arrival of railroads in 1870 really changed Coloradans' relationship to the forests in the state. Coloradans now had access to lumber from other parts of the country.
Colorado did see commercial timber harvest, but not on the scale that you think of the massive timber industry that moved across the United States, starting in the Northeast, moving out to the Pacific Northwest. Colorado was much more isolated than these places. The railroad came somewhat late, and it wasn't extremely economical to ship milled lumber out of the state, but it was being used at a pretty voracious clip within the state itself. That's not to say the forests in Colorado were spared during the settlement period, but generally it wasn't being used for a commercial purpose to ship out of state.
Over time, the forests of the Pacific Northwest, the Upper South, Northern California started coming into Colorado. After about 1870, virtually all of the lumber used to construct Denver came from outside of Colorado. After the arrival of railroads and the development of new mining and smelting methods over the course of the 1870s, as well as new mineral discoveries in places like Leadville, Colorado really began to take off.
And it was an explosive growth of people that came into the state in a fairly short amount of time.
The degree to which mining thrives and disperses, that's the degree to which forests really take a hit.
Many miners never found gold, of course, and so they started turning into farmers, ranchers. These are occupations that they generally knew well from where they originally came from.
For most of its history, the United States' official land policy was to dispose of land. Not throw it away, but give it to states and private individuals and private corporations. So think the railroad grants, think the Homestead Acts. And the idea was, we're trying to encourage settlement of this continent. The Homestead Act really allowed you to claim federal land, and generally it meant ranching and farming.
And this was initially unregulated, and it was basically a free-for-all.
When you're giving all that land away and different groups are using these natural resources at such an astounding rate, it was creating problems for the people that remained in areas that had been deforested. They already understood at that time if you clear-cut a mountainside, it was going to release a lot of sediment the next year when the snows and the rains and the runoff came, and it would clog up the irrigation projects. There was real talk of a wood famine.
There was concern about what will happen to the watersheds if they don't have forests.
We'd explored all the way to the Pacific Ocean by this time and realized, well, there's an end point. There is a finite resource that we might use up.
There was fear of what would happen if the treatment of forests in the Rockies followed the pattern of the treatment of forests in the upper Midwest and in many parts of the South.
And this was part of the conservation movement with the idea of let's have trained experts solve these natural resource issues that we're having. How do you keep from overusing these natural resources and wealth that we have? And for them, the answer was conservation.
For the first time since Europeans set foot on this continent, a large area of land was set aside to remain preserved forever. Yellowstone, the first national park, was created in 1872. At the same time, this seed of an idea began to germinate in Colorado.
Part of their constitutional convention had a section on forests and management, issues of deforestation and overgrazing.
A pretty large area of the mountains, in particular in Colorado, was never going to be homesteaded, and areas that didn't include paying quantities of minerals were not going to be privatized through mining law. So in the 1870s and 1880s, Coloradans active in forestry issues really wanted to protect Colorado's forests. We see people like Frederick Ebert of Denver, Colonel Ensign of Colorado Springs, William J. Palmer, also of Colorado Springs, really taking active measures, and they were part of a larger movement that resulted in the Forest Reserve Act of 1891. And that act is really a landmark in American environmental history.
Congress gave the president power to reserve forested landscapes out of the public domain. It was just one sentence, and it was a pretty inauspicious start, but this was the very first change in federal policy from giving land away full-time, all the time. Now there was this one little opening that said, okay, land could be reserved. And that was an entirely new concept at the time. President Benjamin Harrison, within a couple of years of this law being passed, he reserves about 3 million acres in Colorado as some of the first forest reserves in the country. And it wasn't because he was a Coloradoan who had his eye on some favorite landscapes he liked to go to. He had actually been receiving letters and petitions from local Colorado residents. So that was kind of the genesis of Colorado's first forest reserves, actually local lobbying the President of the United States. This was a really radical idea at the time. There was no other country on earth that was creating public lands for the public to use. So we were operating without a script.
The challenge of figuring out how to actually govern them. It really took a couple of decades to work out. Initially, there were very few boots on the ground, as it were. These are huge swaths of land with very few rangers. The rangers were often locals. And so for the first couple of decades, grazing, logging, other uses of these forests were essentially unregulated, with some exceptions. Early in the 20th century, though, the federal government started to take a more active role.
During Theodore Roosevelt's presidency, he adds about another 150 million acres of national forests to that system. And in 1905, he signs a law called the Transfer Act that actually took the forest reserves and formally transferred them to the Department of Agriculture and a new agency called the Forest Service to actually manage these lands. Theodore Roosevelt appoints Gifford Pinchot the first chief of this new agency, the U.S. Forest Service. Their idea of conservation was for the greatest amount of good, for the largest number, for the longest amount of time. They wanted not only you to use the land, but they wanted your grandchildren to use that land as well. And this applied to grazing. Very quickly in 1906, Gifford Pinchot issues national forest-wide grazing regulations. Basically, you had to obtain a permit to run sheep or cattle on national forests. And they were trying to figure out a formula where there was going to be a finite number of animals that would be allowed on the landscape so that the landscape would survive grazing year to year. Right at the beginning of this grazing period, they issued roughly 230,000 permits for cattle and about 539,000 permits for sheep. This was at a time when the population was roughly just over 500,000. So there was actually more sheep and cattle in 1907 than there were people. So it's not an insignificant industry at the time. It's pretty large.
And of course, this generated a lot of tension. A lot of Coloradans were not happy about federal conservation. We see a real sort of rural-urban divide. Federal conservation was very popular among urbanites, among businessmen in Front Range communities. It was quite popular among Eastern Plains farmers as well. All of these people realized that the forests were important for tourism, they were important for protecting irrigation. But folks in Western Colorado often took a dimmer view of federal efforts to control how they interacted with the forest that surrounded them and that they become accustomed to using.
Both Gifford Pinchot and Theodore Roosevelt traveled to Colorado to argue for the new permitting system. While ranchers initially resisted regulation, in the end, they actually endorsed the policy, understanding the benefits down the road.
They saw there might be some restrictions at first, but it's for stability of our entire industry over time. So in 1910, the Forest Service opens the Office of Grazing Studies, and this was to do reconnaissance of rangelands so that we actually had scientific data of what the landscape could handle, what its carrying capacity would be for livestock.
During the early 1900s, several more national parks were created within the newly established National Parks system. But overgrazing sheep and cattle still threatened Colorado's forested landscapes. The federal government intervened, passing the Taylor Grazing Act of 1934 to regulate grazing on all remaining federal lands.
There hasn't been major legislation regarding grazing. Since 1960, when Congress passed in law what the national forests were supposed to be used for and what the Forest Service was supposed to manage them for. Grazing, timber production, wildlife, recreation, and fire. American views about wildfire predate the Forest Service and go back into the 19th century, where there's an old adage that fire follows people. As people move out into any kind of natural landscape outside the towns, people accidentally cause fires. People cause fires on purpose. And back in the 19th century, there was a series of extremely deadly disaster fires. The 1825 Miramichi fire in Maine and Canada, hundreds died, where a large fire burns over a town that's surrounded by forests. Same thing happens in Peshtigo, Wisconsin in 1871, where up to, they estimate, somewhere around 1,500 people died. More would have died if fleeing residents hadn't made it to a couple of rivers in Green Bay, literally running into the bay. More people died on that fire than the Great Chicago Fire of the same year. Fast forward just a few years later to 1910, and the same type of disaster fire strikes, but now it strikes out west, and it strikes a national forest. The 1910 Great Northern Rockies fires, burning about 3 million acres in about 48 hours. Overran the city of Wallace, Idaho, overran firefighters and people trying to contain the blazes. The U.S. Army had to be called out to help restore order and help clean up after these fires. And 1910 is just 5 years into the existence of the U.S. Forest Service. And the reaction was swift. We need to stop these fires. There's great loss of life, but trees were money. This is what you could build your community out of.
So fire suppression by the early 20th century is becoming a version of wisdom. The notion that you would waste all this wonderful resource, that idea is just becoming intolerable.
And so the consensus view was fight fire. And literally after the 1910 fires, the federal government doubled the Forest Service budget with the express direction to go put fires out. It's very, very hard to find in the historic record times where Congress doubles a federal agency's budget.
And you don't have to persuade people who are living in proximity to public lands forests, because it's their towns, their residences, their farmlands that are going to be burned over.
But the question was, what could they actually do about it? Early on, they didn't have very many actual rangers. Their firefighting techniques were pretty haphazard. They didn't even have very good ways of knowing when fires had broke out.
Everything was a hand tool. Transportation is extremely difficult in the backcountry. And this was the early 20th century where 30+ million acres was average burned per year. Today, it's normally less than 10.
For over 2 decades, the goal of fighting fires was a slow and painful task, only made more so by the burgeoning Great Depression.
Discouragement, fear, failure.
But this dark era brought fortune to forested land across the United States through President Franklin D. Roosevelt's Works Progress Administration, which gifted jobless men and the Forest Service with a mutually beneficial program. the Civilian Conservation Corps.
Today, depression is a fading memory.
The Civilian Conservation Corps gave the Forest Service really the manpower to actually start to be able to achieve this goal of controlling wildfire. So in 1935, the Forest Service issues a new policy called the 10 a.m. policy. And the idea was to control every wildfire by 10 a.m. the morning after its first report. And that really becomes policy for the next 50 years plus for the Forest Service. I would refer to it as total suppression. And we start being more successful in that goal. The Civilian Conservation Corps also helped accelerate the building of fire towers, which aided in reporting wildfires. They also string miles and miles and miles of telephone wire, which aids in the reporting of wildfires. And also during this period is when the CCC builds a tremendous amount of roads throughout the national forests in the West, which can get firefighters quicker to a small fire before it grows big. And we start being more successful in that goal from the 1930s on. During World War II, the Wartime Advertising Council started the Smokey Bear campaign.
So remember, only you can prevent forest fires.
Wood was a vital resource even in World War II. And people sometimes don't think of that. They think, well, didn't we have metal planes and tanks that were fighting World War II? Yes. But how did you get all the war material overseas that we fought with? You shipped them in wooden containers. And so wood was actually a very vital resource to the war effort. The Ad Council found that at one point, Smokey Bear was the most recognizable figure after Santa Claus in the United States.
With the marketing help of Smokey and advances in technology, the goal after World War II of controlling wildfires became more and more successful, with yearly fire averages dropping from 53 million acres to 3 million. But then, post-World War II, the modern conservation movement was born, and many researchers began to understand how integral fires are to forested landscapes.
But it takes decades for the scientific consensus of, hey, fire does a lot of good for the forest to actually translate into policy at a national level. The National Park Service officially changed its policy in 1968 to give fire managers more options in letting particularly backcountry fires do some good ecological work if conditions were right. And it's not until 1978 when the U.S. Forest Service officially changes its policy to allow the same thing.
From fire to mining and grazing, researchers have increasingly pursued the question, how exactly have we impacted our forests? Now, scientists have begun to uncover the many mysteries of our changing forests. The root of much of this change lies in the industry that developed our state, mining. Beginning in the middle of the 19th century, miners cut and logged forests and caused fires, intentionally and unintentionally. Although most forests would recover over time as new trees seeded into the landscape, the synchronization of this growth would have consequences over a century later.
In the late 1990s, trees such as lodgepole pine were of a size that were highly susceptible to attack by mountain pine beetle. So the fire events that occurred in the second half of the 19th century really set up the landscape for the extensive bark beetle outbreaks that began in the 1990s and continued for mountain pine beetle up until very recently, about 2012.
But the mining industry's influence on the landscape did not end with its dissipation. At middle elevation sites, mining was heaviest, and prospering towns grew. In and around the industry's destruction, people continued to build their homes, shops, and roads, limiting the amount forests could recover in these areas.
Places that were mined really heavily, these middle elevation sites, we actually didn't see much forest gain across the 20th century. We have these really extreme hot spots. So like the 4 Mile Canyon area west of Boulder was mined really, really heavily. Central City and Blackhawk, similar story.
Where mining did not flourish, trees filled the landscape.
Places that had sort of a low to moderate amount of mining, the low elevation sites and the high elevation sites. We saw a lot of forest gain.
Whether forests have gained or lost tree cover, it is apparent that our mining activities have had an influence. While mining has left some extremely visible scars across the landscape, other activities have left more subtle imprints.
It wasn't the miners who made all the money. It was the people who supplied those miners, the ranchers. So those ranchers brought in lots of sheep and cattle grazing.
For most of Colorado's history, livestock were allowed to graze on forested lands, depleting them of grasses. These grasses, however, were essential to maintaining frequent, healthy fires in our lower elevation forests.
The ecological role of those fires was to kill baby trees. These fires would come along before they had a chance to reach overstory status, kill 99.9% of them.
With most young trees allowed to mature, these forests have become denser. And this density has been reinforced in areas due to our accomplished history of fire suppression. But while fire suppression and grazing have both contributed to density, they have had opposing influences on the forest floor. Grazing has reduced grassy fuels, but other fuels like needle litter and branches have collected for decades without the occurrence of fire to clear them away. Together, more dense forests, rooted in thick floors of fuel, have changed forest dynamics at lower elevations.
Instead of having surface fires that just killed the smaller trees, we're having larger fires with higher severity that are killing even the larger trees.
But this may not be the case for all forests. Those at higher elevations typically experience less frequent fires.
They're much cooler, they're much wetter, and so those forests don't burn quite as often.
Typically, you'd have at least 100 and sometimes several hundred years between fires affecting the same areas.
With such long fire cycles compared to our relatively short history of modern human influence, researchers are uncertain how much fire suppression and overgrazing have exactly affected these high elevation forests. It's clear Colorado's forests have changed in a variety of ways, but how much is due to our recent activities or management practices, and how much is due to a changing climate?
Large fires were very uncommon within human memory in the Front Range. The Buffalo Creek fire started on May 18th, 1996. It was human-caused. It was an escaped campfire. There was an extreme wind event, and the fire burned 10,000 acres in a day. And nobody living had seen a fire like that in the Front Range. And then 2 months later, there was an extreme thunderstorm event on top of the burn that caused massive flooding, lots of damage.
The firehouse is demolished. The community center is carried downstream. Trees are uprooted, homes are damaged, and cars are swept away. In the end, 2 people are found dead.
Then in 2002 was the Hayman fire. And that was, at that time, the largest fire that had happened in Colorado. It burned 138,000 acres, 133 homes. It started on June 8th, 2002. It was also human-caused, and it burned under extreme conditions. It made a run on June 9th where it burned 60,000 acres, including trees that had clearly survived a lot of fires. We had an almost 1,000-year tree ring chronology there, and it burned hot in one day.
Across 60 to 70% of the total fire area, all of the trees are gone.
That's pretty astounding when you walk around in a big place like that. It just feels very, very different. I was living here. We woke up in the morning with a ½ inch of ash on our car a couple days. When you experience a thing and you see it change, It's much different than just experiencing it after it changed. This idea of shifting baselines, where we talk about the environment that you're raised in, indicating how you think about a certain issue. Change on the landscape is a similar thing. If people are born into an area and they see it start in a certain way, that's what they think of as normal. People that tend to recognize the fact that Colorado has changed quite a bit are older folks, because they've experienced a lot of the changes firsthand.
The Hayman fire itself occurred in the same year as fires all across Colorado.
All of Colorado is burning today.
The 2002 fire year was in conjunction with the most extreme drought that we've had in the modern climate record. About the same time, late 1990s, we had the beginning of the massive outbreak of mountain pine beetle, especially on the western slope. That was driven by drought. So that was a kind of a turning point in the sense that a lot of people who might have had some uncertainty about the reality of climate change, the effects of warming, they started to think and to say, yeah, okay, we get it. We're seeing some impacts of warming. We expect that we're going to have increases in fire, increases in bark beetle, and that's already initiated since the 1980s. We've seen more than a 2.5-fold increase in the annual rate of tree mortality.
Humans have very short memories, and even within our own lifetimes, we tend not to think of the entire temporal spectrum.
We need a longer window of understanding of climate variation. There's a record of climate in the tree rings.
When you're dealing with trees, you're dealing with organisms that live for centuries. And when you're dealing with ecosystems, you're dealing with communities that have existed for millennia. Forests have legacies, forests have memory. When you get organisms that live 600-700 years, you have these legacies. I have a couple of chronologies that go back into the early 1000s. It's just the bare root end of a ponderosa pine that has been dead for centuries. Dates to 980. So Vikings were going to Iceland at that time. And we can read that code back into time. If you go back 1,000 years, you are in a very different climatic era. You're in what has been called the medieval warm period, which was on average about 3 degrees warmer than the 20th century. I've found pieces of ponderosa pine, which is now the lower elevation dominant, up as high as 10,700 feet, miles from the nearest living ponderosa pine, thousands of feet higher than the current living ponderosa pine. They were living up there during the medieval warm period because it was warmer at higher elevations. If you age trees up at upper tree line, it's pretty clear that upper tree line advanced upslope during that warmer period of time. What we could be staring at now with climate change, as temperatures get warmer, as droughts get longer, is the whole elevational gradient of forest is going to walk back up the slope. Where the concern is that this change is happening more quickly than ones that we have observed in the past. And trees migrate very slowly by seeding into their next environment, and they may not be able to keep up with that pace. So some of the lower elevation areas that have burned really hot may not regenerate to trees. It may be too hot and dry for them.
We're seeing snowmelt occurring very early. That increases the growing season. That's great for the plants until it gets late summer and there's no water. Then they get drought stressed. But what also happens when you increase the growing season is you increase your fire season.
There are projections that with an increase of 1 degree Celsius warming, you see more than doubling of the fire activity in the western US.
Our winters are getting warmer. In winter, temperatures that were really cold served as a mechanism to reduce bark beetle populations. And so since we're not getting as cold in the winter, those bark beetles are surviving over the winter And so there's more of them that emerge in the summer, and then there's more of them that can kill trees. And we're seeing that already with the mountain pine beetle in our lodgepole pine forest, but now we're seeing it in our spruce forest with the spruce bark beetle.
Predicting the future of our forests is based on climate projections, assumptions about how well we will or will not limit the emissions of greenhouse gases.
Really low emission scenarios are saying that things will change relative to the historical period, but not too much. At this point, a lot of people think that those are pretty unrealistic expectations. Moderate emission scenarios seem to indicate that we'll see a fair bit of warming across the southern Rocky Mountains. High emissions, basically the human population's going to explode over the next century. We're going to continue emitting carbon emissions at an unprecedented rate. Those sorts of assumptions indicate pretty dire scenarios in the southern Rockies. The average drought stress across the southern Rockies could more than double over the next century under those extreme scenarios. And that is a pretty terrifying thought. Under substantial warming, that could mean that the southern Rockies could be like northern Mexico climatically in some ways.
The altitudinal zones that'll be suitable for the forests we recognize, those are shifting upwards at rates that are faster than those forests can colonize. There's ecosystems that are predicted to disappear entirely. The tundra will just be kind of spaced off the mountains.
We are losing some of our forest cover. Areas are not recovering to dense forests, but instead will transition to grasslands and to shrublands. Is that a big deal? It is in terms of carbon storage. If we have a reduction in the forest area, that carbon that otherwise would be stored in the trees would be emitted to the atmosphere. And that's an example of one of these positive feedbacks where it's worse than what we thought it was when we start understanding the feedback that results from burning forests and a lack of recovery.
Forests protect reservoirs from over-sedimentation. As fires continue to escalate, fewer trees could mean less clean water.
Clean water is hugely important. It's probably our most important resource in the western U.S.
The cities in the Front Range, we actually live in a desert. We don't get a lot of water. So all of our water comes from those watersheds above us that are all surrounded by forests.
A fire leaves such a disrupted landscape and so much sediment and ash waiting to be picked up by any rainstorm that comes along. So what happens if we're depending for close to 80% of our supply on an area that is so susceptible?
The recreational value, as well as the general tourist dollars brought in by our forest resources, is highly significant to the economy of Colorado.
Recreation is the largest use of national forests today. Recreation contributes about $11.2 billion to the gross national product and adds about 145,000 jobs to the U.S. economy.
At this point, we're not making significant progress on limiting greenhouse gases. We're going exactly in the opposite direction. So this should be a source of alarm.
We're starting to see those kinds of patterns. At the same time, this is building on this legacy of fire exclusion, of timber harvest, all these other impacts that we've had in the forest.
When you pull on something, you find out it's hitched to everything else. Climate and topography and forest type and human activity, all of these things are interrelated, and kind of timing is everything.
To actually know a place, you have to understand a lot about it. You really have to understand the historical context and the way things work in that particular location, because every place in the landscape is different.
So managers have to have an understanding of what the past of their forest was like.
Has this stand been cut before? What species composition do we want to have as a desired condition when we're done? What was the past fire history of this stand? That will make a difference in terms of what you might do and when you would do that activity. And you would do different types of treatments and different types of forest types that are appropriate.
There is no value in a one-size-fits-all approach. You have to recognize that not only over space, but over time, conditions are going to change.
As more and more human structures encroach on forest lands, however, the more difficult it is to manage them. These points of ever-increasing intersection are known to scientists and historians as the wildland-urban interface.
This has been a great trend of the last 50 or 60 years.
Particularly after World War II, the suburbanization, rise of a lifestyle economy in Colorado, we see people really wanting to live in the mountains near trees. This is a problem, of course, because these forests burn. It's also a problem because some human activities, at least, were increasing the likelihood and the intensity of those fires.
The more people that move here, the greater the impact from humans in natural systems.
3.5% of Colorado's landmass is categorized as wildland-urban interface. However, 42% of Colorado's population lives in that 3.5% landmass. We're talking 2.2 million-ish people live in what we consider the wildland-urban interface. That makes it much harder for fire managers and firefighters on the ground to let a fire go. Even if it's doing good ecological work, if there's homes up on that ridge, their first priority has to be those homes and those lives up there.
And so every time a fire starts, we put it out, but that just kicks the can down for the next time a fire starts.
It makes fire management much more of a challenge.
And that means that, unfortunately, we're probably going to have to move towards more strict zoning laws. We're going to have to move towards more strict public policy, more strict management of national parks, and more strict management of national forests, regulating the amount of recreational use in places.
Forests in Colorado simultaneously divide people and bring them together. When we look at the management of these forests, it's a really balkanized world.
Colorado is a really fragmented place because of its complex history. Homesteads, mining claims, a lot of things that split up land in Colorado.
In some ways, then, forested lands are really fragmented, and that's further fragmented those ecosystems. On the other hand, though, nature doesn't really respect those property boundaries. The forests transcend borders. Key dynamics of those ecosystems transcend those borders, whether we're talking about mountain pine beetle or wildland fire. And I think this has really been a spur to collaboration and to collective action.
Historians really have such interesting case studies of when troubles or even calamities cause human communities to come together, and when calamities, tragedies cause human communities just to fracture and fall apart. And both things can happen. I know which one I prefer, but what's going to be the response? Cooperation, collaboration, or contention and blame and conflict?
And so there's really an opportunity here for people to come together and to work together despite those boundaries that divide them.
To actually do things in the management of forests, you have to focus on all land management categories, and that involves a lot of collaboration. If you live in these local communities, you actually have a lot of say in the things that happen around you. Go to public forums, go to public meetings.
Look into the local grassroots organizations around to volunteer or to provide comments. Some of these collaboratives do have a citizen science portion that the citizens are out there collecting the data.
Even if you aren't physically able to go out there and actually do the things yourself, you can interact with the people that are making decisions and deciding what's going to happen, because you do have a say in what goes on in the forests around us. Humans are really good at making changes when we see that there's a problem. We're retrospective. We're not as good at doing these preventative solutions to problems, but there's some evidence that we've been able to do that in the past. So I have hopes that humanity will be able to recognize that there's a problem and start to address it. We haven't taken tremendous steps over the past couple decades, but I would say I'm kind of an optimist. I think that the moderate emission scenarios could be realistic, as long as we start to take some pretty big steps in the next 2 decades.
I'm pretty optimistic that we'll still have forests into the future. They may look different. They might not look like the forests that you saw when you were a kid, but trees have been around a lot longer than humans, and I think they'll continue to be around. They're pretty resilient. the snapshot that we're seeing is just a small portion of what is happening in the lifespan of a tree.
We're going to have less forest in the future than we did in the past. I'm very optimistic that under future climate conditions, we will have some forest species that are adapted to those conditions. We may have to walk to a little bit higher elevation to recreate in those forests.
Understand that we're going to see trees die on the landscape. There are areas we can prioritize with some management to maintain the integrity of the ecosystem, looking into different research that we can do so that our grandkids still have some forest to look at in the future.
We may be heading into conditions that haven't existed within the period of time that we've been able to study and understand. We don't know how ecosystems are going to adapt, although we're trying to figure that out. But one thing I do know is that people are going to have to learn to adapt. We can't keep doing things the way we've been doing them.
A lot of the decisions that we make are driven by the things that we want as a society. More than science, more than economics, it's what society actually wants out of the landscapes we live in.
We have to decide that. Do we want forests? Do we like forests? And do we want to maintain our forests? If we decide that all those answers to the questions are yes, then we need to figure out how best to manage them now, and certainly for the near future.
What would Colorado be without its forests? It's such a part of living here. It would be an immense tragedy if we let our complacence get the better of us.